In the late 19th century, European powers scrambled over Africa, brutally colonizing one country after another. Only one African state managed to stave off the onslaught of European occupation during this period: Ethiopia. Italy, for its part, targeted Ethiopia. However, in 1896, when the Italian troops invaded Ethiopia from their coastal enclave at Massawa on the Red Sea, they were routed by the Ethiopian Emperor Menelik II. 40 years later, however, the Italian dictator Benito Mussolini took revenge. However, the spirit of resistance of the Ethiopian people continued into the 20th century, culminating in 1941 when, with British support, Ethiopia once again overcame Italian occupation. These two momentous events not only safeguarded Ethiopia's freedom, but also inspired other African nations in their struggle against colonial rule. By 1885, the so-called scramble for Africa was fully underway, with the United Kingdom, France, Germany, Italy, Belgium, Spain and Portugal carving up virtually the entire continent of Africa among themselves. At the peak of colonialism, only Liberia, created for the resettlement of free black Africans, and Ethiopia remained independent. Italy, a newcomer to colonial endeavors, began its expansion in 1885 by occupying the Red Sea port of Massawa with Britain's encouragement. From this strategic point, Italy extended its reach across the Horn of Africa, establishing the colony of Eritrea on land previously controlled by Ethiopia and occupying much of what is now Somalia. During this period, Italian commanders made several attempts to stop the Italian advance, achieving some notable successes. However, the Italians skillfully exploited rivalries among Ethiopian leaders to further their colonial ambitions. In 1889, Italy and Ethiopia's Emperor Menelik II signed a treaty in which Menelik recognized Italy's claim to Eritrea in exchange for a loan of arms and money. This particular treaty was crafted in two languages, Amharic and Italian, with significant differences between the versions. The Italian version of the treaty designated Ethiopia as a protectorate, while the Amharic version stated that Ethiopia had the option to report to Italy when dealing with other European powers. Upon discovering these discrepancies, Emperor Menelik attempted to resolve the issue through diplomatic channels, but his efforts were unsuccessful. Consequently, in 1893, Emperor Menelik formally denounced the treaty. Emperor Menelik and his wife Taitu Betu, a shrewd opponent of European expansionism, prepared to defend their sovereignty. In addition to securing modern weapons, they launched a public relations campaign with the help of several Europeans sympathetic to their cause. During this fight against Italian occupation of their territory, Empress Taitu played a pivotal role in maintaining Ethiopian sovereignty. It is even reported that when an Italian diplomat cautioned her that refusing Italy's efforts to make Ethiopia a protectorate would result in a loss of dignity for Italy, she responded, "We too must retain our dignity. You want other countries to see Ethiopia as your protege, but that would never be." Facing the common threat of Italian aggression, Emperor Menelik successfully unified his country's divided provincial rulers. In September 1895, he called for a mass mobilization and managed to assemble a force of approximately 80,000 to 120,000 troops. Men from nearly all of Ethiopia's regions and ethnic groups answered his call, demonstrating a remarkable display of national unity. The emperor himself mobilized some 35,000 troops commanded by his court officials. Meanwhile, his queen, the Empress Taitu, also mobilized her own force of some 6,000 men. The imperial army also included troops raised by governor-generals such as Ras Makonnen, the father of Ras Tafari Makonnen, later Emperor Haile Selassie I, who commanded some 12,000 troops. At the same time, Italy had progressed to within roughly 250 miles of Addis Ababa, Ethiopia's newly established capital. In response, Emperor Menelik, along with Empress Taitu, led his forces northward on a grueling 5-month march that covered nearly 600 miles. From late 1895 into early 1896, Menelik executed a masterful campaign that compelled the overstretched Italian forces to engage on his terms. By threatening to outflank the Italians and endanger Eritrea, Emperor Menelik skillfully maneuvered them into a precarious position, leaving their supply lines exposed and vulnerable to an increasingly hostile local population. This first Italo-Ethiopian war would end in disaster for the would-be colonizer Italy. During the famous Battle of Adwa, Emperor Menelik's forces ambushed the Italian troops, leading to the deaths of over 3,000 Italian soldiers, the greatest loss of European lives during the scramble for Africa. This devastating defeat was so humiliating for Italy that it caused the Francesco Crispi government to collapse upon receiving the news. This defeat not only thwarted Italy's ambitions to colonize Ethiopia, but also shattered the myth that African people were incapable of mounting sophisticated and effective defenses against European imperial invasions. This sour memory of the Battle of Adwa lingered among certain Italians, particularly as other European powers conquered nearly all of Africa, leaving only Ethiopia and American-supported Liberia uncolonized. From this point onwards, the Italians harbored a lasting bitterness over the defeat inflicted by the Ethiopians at Adwa. When the dictator Benito Mussolini came to power in Italy many years later, he was determined to exact revenge. In the early 20th century, Italy's colonial holdings were confined to Libya, Eritrea, and Somalia. The rise of the fascist regime in Italy in 1922 marked a pivotal moment for Italian colonial aspirations. The drive to expand into Ethiopia was fueled by the pressing issues of a rapidly expanding population and escalating unemployment in Italy, which had tripled between 1926 and 1928. Italian colonial possessions in Eritrea and Somalia bordered the northern reaches of Ethiopia, allowing Italian settlers to unlawfully encroach on Ethiopian territory at Wawa from as early as 1930. The now Emperor of Ethiopia, Haile Selassie I, repeatedly dispatched troops to remove the Italians, fearing an imminent invasion. It was in this context that, in November 1934, Ethiopian forces clashed with Italian troops in Ethiopian land, leading to over 100 casualties on both sides. After this skirmish, Italy demanded reparations and an apology from Ethiopia, but the Emperor Haile Selassie chose to bring the matter before the League of Nations. Despite Italy's blatant violation of international norms in Ethiopia, the League of Nations intervention did not yield tangible results. The nations of Britain and France, wary of Germany's growing power, were unwilling to antagonize Italy by strictly enforcing the League of Nations regulations. These two countries prioritized addressing German treaty violations over taking significant action on Ethiopia, thus obstructing the further involvement by the League of Nations in this issue. All of this gave the Italian dictator Benito Mussolini more confidence, and he initiated the Italian invasion of Ethiopia on October 3, 1935, launching the Italian campaign from Eritrea. By October 15, the Italians had captured Aksum, and 3 weeks later, Mekelle fell. Using aerial attacks and mustard gas, the Italians steadily advanced southward through Tigray over the following months, defeating successive Ethiopian armies. On November 18, the League of Nations placed sanctions on Italy, but it omitted the export of oil, which would have been a major dampener on the Italian campaign in Ethiopia. In a war that lasted 7 months, Ethiopia was outmatched by Italy in armaments, a situation exacerbated by the fact that a League of Nations arms embargo was not enforced against Italy. In early April 1936, Italian forces had advanced to Desse in the north and Harare in the east. On May 2, 1936, Emperor Haile Selassie I departed for French Somaliland in exile, a decision that stirred resentment among some Ethiopians who had been accustomed to a warrior emperor. Italian forces entered Addis Ababa on May 5, and by June 1936, Italy had captured the capital and declared the King of Italy as the ruler of Ethiopia. On June 30, 1936, Emperor Haile Selassie delivered a compelling speech at the League of Nations presenting two options: support for collective security or acceptance of international lawlessness. This speech resonated deeply with many and elevated the emperor to a prominent international figure. The Italian invasion of Ethiopia elicited reactions worldwide, spanning from African nations to Europe. While Britain and France eventually acknowledged Italy's control of Ethiopia, the United States and the Soviet Union refused to do so, setting them apart from other major powers. Italy merged Ethiopia with Eritrea and Somalia to create Italian East Africa. On June 11, 1936, Marshal Rodolfo Graziani assumed control of Ethiopia. Despite the Italians' declaration in December of that year that the entire country was pacified and under their effective control, Ethiopian resistance toward Italian rule persisted. The most horrific phase of this Italian occupation occurred in February 1937. Following a failed assassination plot against Marshal Graziani on February 19, 1937, Italian colonial authorities carried out the execution of approximately 30,000 Ethiopians, including roughly half of the younger, educated Ethiopian population. These atrocities were primarily perpetrated by the Italian civilian population and were halted only when the military intervened. However, in the ensuing months, the military continued its campaign, killing thousands more, with a particular focus on the nobility and educated class whom they feared might rebel against their rule. The assassination attempt on Graziani is widely seen as a pivotal moment in Ethiopian resistance history. It heralded the onset of a more robust and organized guerrilla warfare, primarily focused in the regions of Shawa, Gojam, and Bagemda. The Ethiopian resistance fighters were mainly armed with ammunition seized from the enemy or supplied by deserters. Notably, during this period, Ethiopian women played a significant part in their resistance, partly in response to the fascist army's systematic policy of using rape as a tool of domination. The participation of the Ethiopian women was particularly remarkable and underscored the depth of their commitment to resisting the occupation. In November 1937, Rome appointed a new governor with instructions to pursue a more flexible and adaptable approach to the Italian occupation of Ethiopia. Consequently, significant public works projects were initiated, including the construction of Ethiopia's inaugural system of enhanced roads. However, concurrently, the Italians rigorously enforced racial segregation, including residential separation, as comprehensively as possible. The Italian occupation of Ethiopia never fully succeeded in transforming the country into a colony. Resistance among the Ethiopian people was widespread, and patriot forces made it incredibly challenging for the Ethiopians to maintain control. While the Italians controlled most major towns, a significant portion of their army was confined to forts due to the ongoing resistance by the patriot forces. The turning point of the Italian occupation of Ethiopia came with the outbreak of World War II. Benito Mussolini's declaration of war against France and Britain on June 10, 1940 clarified the alignment of the two fronts involved in this global conflict. Britain, compelled by the need to confront the enemy on all fronts, could no longer maintain neutrality in the Ethiopian-Italian conflict. This turn of events also meant that Emperor Haile Selassie I, who had been living in exile in Bath in the UK, was now seen as an ally by Britain. Consequently, Britain and the Emperor aimed to collaborate with Ethiopian and other local forces to drive the Italians out of Ethiopia and British Somaliland, which the Italians had seized in August 1940, and to counter the Italian invasion of Sudan. Emperor Haile Selassie I promptly traveled to Khartoum, Sudan, where he established closer communication with both the British headquarters and the resistance forces in Ethiopia. This joint effort of fighters entered Gojam, Ethiopia on January 20, 1941, encountering little resistance as the Italians quickly surrendered. Upon defeating the Italians with British help, on May 5, 1941, Emperor Haile Selassie made a triumphant return to Addis Ababa. Despite objections from the British occupation authorities, the emperor swiftly re-established his government. Over the next decade, Emperor Haile Selassie focused on rebuilding the administration, strengthening the army, and enacting legislation to regulate the government, church, and financial system. He also worked to extend his control over the provinces, quelling revolts in regions like Gojam and Tigray. Don't forget to like and share the video if you enjoyed it. Thank you all for tuning in. This has been Tatenda for African Biographics. Until next time, cheers. Have a good one.